Because each government will claim that they are the ones who've done everything. That is normal. That I think every previous government will say, we've done better than everyone else. India, that is Bharat. I mean, that's a very simple rule that I have. Listen to what they say, but watch what they do. The first question will be, you think you're so great that you can solve this. What happened? All these great people who preceded you, they couldn't solve it. Why didn't they solve it? They had a reason. For me, there are many Pakistans, and you should deal with it accordingly.
Hello guys and welcome back to AP Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into AP Podcast. I genuinely appreciate you all showing so much of interest. And if you are a new subscriber, if you are a new viewer, make sure you subscribe us. We post genuine content in regards to almost all the topics that there exist in the society every Saturday at sharp 7 p.m. And talking about today's episode, guys, for today's episode, we have with us a very big name, Shiv Shankar Menon sir. Menon sir is a very robust name when it comes to diplomacy. And if you are someone who has studied diplomacy or has little bit of interest in foreign affairs or external affairs, then I think you know what Menon sir is. Menon sir has served at various locations at topmost diplomatic positions possible in very hostile countries like Pakistan as well, and he has also been the national security advisor. In this podcast, we delve into many topics that is at the moment very relevant with the current Indian image that we have. As of now, what sort of image we are building, what India has become in last 10 years, what is the amount of impact that now India is showing to all the Western countries that exist out there. What's the role of America, the role of China, how far we are or how ahead we are. Everything, pretty much everything was discussed in this podcast. So I genuinely hope this is a very good overdose for you if you're someone who really wants to understand the external affairs or the international affairs of your country. So, with that, AP Podcast rolling in 3, 2, 1. First of all, Shiv Shankar sir, utmost gratitude from my side for coming on AP Podcast and giving us this very, very ambient location, I'd say. And this has such a great vibe attached with it. And I'm really very grateful for both the location and your time.
Well, thank you for asking me, and I'm very glad to speak to you.
Yeah.
I hear you've done 60 podcasts already. So that's quite an achievement.
That's a small number, sir.
No, it's quite an achievement. It's considering you're also doing other things. You're also a student.
Yeah, sir. So peer pressure is increasing nowadays a lot. So we have to be involved in multiple aspects, I'd say. Yeah. So with that only, sir, I picked up peer pressure. I'd like to dive into the whole narrative of India at the moment. India, Bharat, whatever people would like to call it.
India, that is Bharat.
India?
That is Bharat.
India, that is Bharat, yeah.
Which is what the Constitution says. So.
That's the true word, sir. So, from there only, sir, in the last 10 years, how do you see this country has grown rapidly? Because, sir, you are someone who has spent so much of time seeing this country from both outside and inside. I don't think so there might be anyone else who could pretty much tell a very clear image about India, or that is Bharat, that we are having at the moment. So let it be economically, let it be internationally, or let it be even politically. How do you see India has developed in the last 10 years?
Well, if you ask anyone of my generation, I think would tell you that what they've seen in their life. And so I wouldn't say it's only 10 years or it's only 12 years, because each government will claim that they are the ones who've done everything. That is normal. That I think every previous government will say, we've done better than everyone else. But it is true. India's economic growth and development has steadily accelerated. In the first few decades after independence, we were not growing so fast. In fact, for a long time, population was growing very rapidly. It's only after the 80s and then when radical reform began in 91 that we then actually, from the 80s onwards, we did over 30 years of 7% plus growth. That slowed down a bit because of the world situation after the global financial crisis in 2008. And so our high growth years were really, I would say, after the drastic reforms began and before the globalized world economy slowed down itself. And then, of course, we got hit by the pandemic. So, but growth compared to the rest of the world, we have consistently done better than everybody else, except China.
Except China.
Except China, which in the same 30 years that we grew over 7%, was growing by almost 10%. And which is why, if you look at the various elements of metrics of power, we have done better than most countries and improved our relative position vis-a-vis all these countries. So we have consistently done better. China, in 1980, the economy was about the same size as India. Today, it's bigger than the Indian economy. But now China has slowed down, and China has slowed down quite drastically. So in fact, we are actually growing faster than China today in the last few years. We were all hit by pandemic, but China's growth has been slowing actually over the last decade. So if you look at it, we are the fastest growing large economy in the world. So in economic terms, if you look at it, we have improved our relative position steadily over decades. And now the question is, of course, because this is all relative, depends also on how other people do. Other aspects, if you look at human development indicators, for instance, child mortality, maternal mortality, issues like that, we still have a long way to go. And especially in, even in things like education, improving the quality of our education, employment, for instance. We have a lot to do to improve the welfare of our people. And that, it's been a very unusual period in the recent past. You had the pandemic, you had, as I said, the global economic slowdown, you've had a whole host of issues. So it's difficult for me, at least at my age, because I'm old enough to remember even beyond 10 years, right? For your generation, you came of age in these 10 years. That's what you remember. But I remember how bad it used to be, how it had improved, and how it has kept improving. And what I see today is that we are in some ways dealing with the results of our success.
So it's like half of the generation
we still have a long way to go. If we want an India which is modern, secure, prosperous, where every Indian can achieve their potential, at least has the opportunity, we still have a long way to go. So we can never say our job is finished, right? But we are getting there, and at least we have a reasonable prospect of getting there. And that's more than most countries in the world can say today. So for me, I'm always an optimist about India that is Bharat. I mean, that's consistent in bad times also and in good times. And how good the times are, different people will tell you different things.
And how do you tell it?
For me, for my generation who know how bad it was, India is always better than it was before. But we want it to be even better. So we'll never be satisfied, and we should never be satisfied.
Even if we are a developed country.
Even if you're developed, you have to make sure that all your people can participate in that development.
But isn't it that things can get bit extremist when it comes to India? Because sort of this thing happened in US, especially if we recall the time when last time elections were happening. There was this huge crowd that just went into White House. There were shot fire, guns and all that stuff. And obviously gun culture is there in US. So yes, US is the most powerful country.
Well, they have political issues in the US which are serious.
Yeah.
I first went to the US in the 60s when a president had just been assassinated, when his brother, who was a candidate for the presidency, got shot, when Martin Luther King got shot, when the country was divided on civil rights. I mean, the blacks didn't have the rights, that equal rights, until 1964. They didn't get civil rights by an act that Johnson passed. By when the country was completely divided on Vietnam, Students were killed in Kent State University demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. Every decade I have remembered people saying, oh, the US is finished, collapsed. In the 60s when I first went, I mean, if you look at these kinds of problems, you would say this country is finished, right? It wasn't finished. 75, after the Vietnam War, when Saigon fell to the communists to the north, everyone said that's the end of the US as a global power.
Nothing happened.
Nothing happened. I mean, different things happened. Then again, by the 90s, when recession, Clinton got elected, and they were saved by technology. The internet, 93, the dot-com, the economy actually carried them, and globalization helped the US to continue growing. So the US, if you look at the US share of the world economy, 1980, 25%, now again 25%. It's gone up and down 1%, it's roughly the same. You look at Europe, used to be 30% of the world GDP in 1980. It's down to 16% now. The big gainers are India and China. China went from about 3% to 17.8% or so by 2016. India went to 7.8%, again from 3% in 1980. So if you look at India and China together, we're about equivalent to the US share
The
of
share
the global
of India and China in
together,
but not in alone spaces.
but
right?
not alone.
Okay.
Alone, the US stays roughly the same. So all this talk of US decline, which I've been hearing for 40 years.
So it's like US also favors this thing that India and China should stay against.
Should stay separate.
Should stay separate.
Because what is the US goal since World War II? To prevent the emergence of a peer competitor. And they saw one competitor, Soviet Union, off. At one stage in the 80s, they thought Japan was going to be bigger than them, more powerful. That also they took care of. Now it's China. So they say China is their pacing challenge in the world. They say so openly. And they work to contain that economically, high-tech, restrictions, trade, etc.
All the sanctions and stuff.
And they build, alliances, counterbalancing alliances and so on. I mean, whether it will work or not, we don't know.
But
maybe third time, the challenger is lucky. We don't know.
But with India, I guess they are a bit more, I would say, sound. As in they would never blatantly criticize India. Just because even during this whole Ukraine and Russia thing, somehow, obviously, there was no side from India. But the decisions that they were taking were short of showing that they support Russia in some terms. There was some import of oil from Russia and all that stuff. So during
I'm not sure that actually hurt US interests.
Yeah.
If you think of it, India buying oil from Russia, after the Ukraine war, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 22, the US imposed sanctions, right? And their allies, the Europeans, imposed sanctions, couldn't import oil from Russia. Oil prices went up naturally because, demand is suddenly, and they're looking for alternative. If India and China had bought from the international market, prices would have gone through the roof if we had stopped buying Russian oil. Russia is still the largest producer of fossil fuels when you add oil, gas and coal today on earth. Russia is the biggest producer of these things. So if we had both stopped buying from Russia, we'd have gone to the international market. Smaller supply, big demand. What will happen? The prices will go through the roof. You think the Europeans could have borne the pain? I mean, the alliance would have collapsed.
Yeah.
So frankly, I don't think it hurt their interests that you went and bought from the Russians. And who was your biggest purchaser of refined petroleum products, which were made out of Russian crude oil? Europe, which they needed. So in a sense, you made it easier to make that transition for sanctions to work because you went around it and offered them an escape valve for the consequences of those sanctions. So actually it wasn't against their interest, which is why you didn't see big public pushback.
Yeah.
because they also knew what would happen.
So it was not like they want India to stay their partner or slash friend, if
They
you
would
say
like it.
diplomatically.
They would like it.
So that was the reason they
But
didn't say anything
but you need to
blatantly?
look at the practical effects of that.
Yes.
So they cut you slack. So they let you do what you did. So it was in their interest as much as it was in yours. But this is the difference between reality and what is said. Obviously, publicly, if you ask them, oh, don't you think India should stop buying oil? They'll say, yes, yes, because there are sanctions. They can't say, no, our sanctions have bad effects, so we don't mind. I mean, that's not a credible position for a government to take, right? So I think, but you need to look at, I think, the way the world works in practice. People say a lot, and narratives, all this goes on. But what actually happens, watch what they do. And that tells you what is real.
Okay.
I mean, that's a very simple rule that I have. Listen to what they say, but watch what they do. Because that tells you the reality.
You can hear those words only from a diplomat. I would say that. So from there only, sir, since we are also talking a bit about politics here, and you have yourself been on one of the topmost positions that one can acquire, from foreign secretary to being the national security advisor, and then being Indian High Commission to Pakistan. You have been posted in China. You have been posted in Israel. So these are like very topmost and top tier positions that, as a general person, I see. So even this is a bureaucratic diplomatic setup, but is it like a lot of politics that goes into this?
It's apolitical. I mean, my career was entirely apolitical.
Yeah.
Even NSA I was an appointment, a contract appointment to that. And if you look at it, I mean, I was sent to Israel by the Narasimha Rao government. Was sent to Sri Lanka by Mr. Gujral, who was Prime Minister at that time. I was sent to China as ambassador, to Pakistan as High Commissioner by Mr. Vajpayee when he was Prime Minister. And I was brought home as Foreign Secretary and then as NSA by the Manmohan Singh government. So these are all different parties, different leaders. You know, as I saw my job, I was a civil servant. I was a diplomat. My oath was to India, to the Constitution. So I dealt with it professionally. Politics was not my business.
Even now also.
And even now, I see myself as being apolitical. And frankly, I see that as essential because the political leaders, they can do the politics themselves. They can figure it out. They have enough people around them in the political parties to tell them about the politics. What they need is somebody to tell them the truth professionally. And somebody who can tell them this is the reality. Because the people who are doing politics with them, they have a self-interest in not carrying bad news. Right? But somebody has to speak truth to power. Any good leader knows that he doesn't just want to hear good things from people. He wants to know the reality.
And how was it with
And
you?
So for me, it's clear that your function as a professional is to say, this is the way I think the situation is. This is what I would suggest we do in India's interest. The decision is his. Is the politician's decision. That's why he's the politician, because he's been elected to do that. And he takes the responsibility also. But your job is to make sure that he at least knows the reality and that you give him the best options available. And then they decide. So, and it's an interesting relationship actually, because obviously he will not always take your advice. For political reasons, he might decide various other things, but then that is your job to implement those decisions. But I have always found that I mean, in my entire experience of being in government, and I was there 42 years, it's at no stage did anyone say, no, why'd you say that? Don't say that to me. Don't waste my time. I've never seen that kind of reaction, because every good leader knows that he needs honest advice. And they recognize it. They might not like it, but they recognize that they need it, that it is useful for them. And I think that's what distinguishes successful leaders from others.
So, like, how were you as a diplomat? Were you like that person who used to be upfront with their beliefs that this is the thing,
Well,
this
we
is
were
happening,
always
and this
told,
is
when we
this is the
joined,
situation?
we were told always that, yeah, that's your job. Tell the truth as you see it.
But was it
But
like,
you don't have the decision power. I mean, especially when you're young. But you tell the truth as you see it.
and at higher positions, do you get the decision power?
You have a say in the decision. But as I said, the ultimate responsibility, executive power of the union, is with the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So it's ultimately for the Minister and the Prime Minister and Cabinet, ultimately on some questions, to make the call. So you might have a say. What you say might, and depending on how much sense you make, you'll
And
have
what if
more or
they
less input into the decision.
what if they don't
But it's
wish to
not
go in
your
your
decision.
zone?
That's fine, that's their business. They probably have their reasons.
But it doesn't disrupt your own working and your own
Why
thing.
should it? As long as you've done your job honestly, I don't think it should worry you. And the idea of having a permanent civil service, of having security of tenure for civil servants, is that it insulates them from having to play political games and enables them to do their job honestly, without fear and favor, of favor.
Okay.
I mean, and frankly, it makes sense in many ways. Now, the difficulty is that human beings find it hard to separate the personal from the professional, right? Or the personal from the official. And so not everyone always lives up to this ideal. Even though I think most people try, when you look at civil servants across the board. But those are not the ones anybody notices. Because outside the civil service is what everyone sees. But reputation is a fairly good indicator for most people.
You mean as for a diplomat or a
For a
bureaucrat?
diplomat, for a civil servant, it's the same because you're serving a government. It's just that the bit that you're looking after is different.
And how about this track record thing that is so-called attached with a diplomat or a bureaucrat? As in, you yourself said that governments are changing, leaders are changing. So one might have seen your work, but when the next comes in, how does it
Yeah,
work?
I mean, he'll make his own decision. You look at any Indian politician, and I always say this: we underestimate our politicians.
Oh,
Because the average Indian politician, average size of constituency, let's say in India, will have about 2 million more people, which means he has already worked and made sure that he's got elected by a sizable number out of this. You're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of people who have voted for him. In order to deal with numbers of people like that, he has to be a good judge of people. He has to be very quick in assessing who he can rely on, who can do work, who can't. He's gone through a mill which, again, as I say, we underestimate how hard it is to do politics in India.
do diplomats or bureaucrats do politics?
No, we shouldn't. We do a different kind of politics. Our politics is to get other people to do what we in India want. It's to get other countries to do what we want. Because the primary unit of diplomacy is states, right? So our job is external, to get other people, other countries to do what we want. So in that sense, we're doing politics, but we're not playing domestic politics.
And how do you play this diplomatic cards with some of the countries that are, just like you said, they are saying something and they are doing something, especially some of our very close neighbors only. They do something, they tell something, they do something. So, one day they might be telling we want peace, we want prosperity, we want economic reforms for each other, but the very next day they might be there in, let's say, a very disturbed part of India,
Yeah.
and then they might be taking out their encounters and all that stuff. So, do
There's
things
three
like this
paths to
happen?
this. One is you have to understand why they're doing certain things. You have to be able to distinguish between what they say and what they do. That, I mean, we've established. But you also have to understand why are they doing this, right? You have to think, why do? Look at our smaller neighbors, for instance. many of them bring in outside powers, which leave us not so happy. In the 60s, 70s, it used to be the US and the others. Now you see Chinese influence in your neighborhood.
Yes.
You've seen Maldives, so on. Why do they do this? Because for them, India is the preponderant presence in their life, in every way, socially, economically, every which way, politically. So they want to balance it. After all, they have a sense of their own independence, their own. How do they do it? They can never match India. So they bring in some outside power to try and play you off against them, and them against you, and get what they can from you, get what they can from them. So there you have to understand why they're doing it. So this is not something you can entirely stop. There's no exclusivity in South Asia. You can't say, no, this is my area, nobody else should be here, right? Because they will look for balancing. Next level, you have interests, they have interests, right? But you look for where do your interests coincide and where do they differ. Where they coincide, you can build stakes in the relationship. Make him interested in the relationship, in maintaining the relationship with you, and invested in it, right? You can also build deterrence in the relationship, leverage, both positive and negative, incentive, but also that if...
A bit of warning.
Yeah. I mean, if things go bad, there will be consequences,
We'll
which you might not like.
Be mindful.
Both things. I mean, there's a carrot and stick always at the thing. So you do the calculus of the interest, and you try and build a relationship where you minimize the chance of the bad things happening, that from your point of view, and you maximize the chance of the good things happening. Now, so it's not about winning or losing. It's about creating the right situation where now you will never win everything 100%. The most powerful countries on earth don't get their way all the time. And it doesn't matter whether it's the UN or whether it's wars, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, but you try and minimize, you define your own interests in a way where you at least know that your basic interests are respected, right? What? Your territorial integrity, your security, as you said. I mean, with Bangladesh, you look at the transformation in our relations in the last 15 years. What's the basis of that? That we both help each other's security. The Indian insurgent groups used to get sanctuary in Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina stopped that after 2008. We helped them with their security, with Bangladeshi criminals and others who were on our side of the border, and we helped them with that. On that basis, you then started building an economic relationship, because you had a common interest. You built power lines into Bangladesh, provide power. They allowed you to use their inland waterways, which is your traditional connection to the northeast. You started trading, you started allowing more open travel and so on. So you transformed the relationship by working on your common interest, which was economic, and by guaranteeing certain basic interests, security and so on. And territorial integrity. You solved the border, the remaining problems on the border. There were enclaves and so on. By 2011.
But then why it's so bad with China then? When you see the
with
whole
China,
LAC
the problem is there's three problems. One is, of course, the boundary. You both differ fundamentally on where the boundary is. It's 138,000 square kilometers in dispute. This is more than most countries in the UN, if you look at the area. You have two new states with very strong nationalism. So you're not going to give up your territory easily, nor is he. He thinks it's his, you think it's yours. So you have a problem there, unless you're willing to compromise. And the longer you take, the harder it gets to compromise. Because the first question will be, you think you're so great that you can solve this. What happened? All these great people who preceded you, they couldn't solve it. Why didn't they solve it? They had a reason. And there has to be some huge gain from solving it, right? I mean, what's the gain? If you don't trust each other, then just an agreement is not enough. So And so today, if you look at the situation, both sides are trying to adjust the situation, change ground reality in their favor. The Chinese, because their power has grown so much, think that they have a chance. So they did what they did in 2020 in Galwan. I don't think they achieved what they wanted. And they saw resistance on our side. So now we've got locked into a stalemate. But equally, it's not as though we then can move on and settle this by some easy political compromise. Because in both countries, nationalism has been roused, but you also have strong leaders who rely on nationalism in both countries.
But there it's not democracy, right?
It doesn't matter if it's a democracy. He still has to worry about how his people, his party, his own supporters will feel about it. So, and one reason why the Chinese Communist Party has lasted longer than any other ruling Communist party, even the CPSU of the Soviet Union collapsed 70 years. Chinese have gone much longer ruling now already. One reason is because they do have a responsive form of authoritarianism, where they do listen to what people are doing and they solve local problems. And they've answered the basic political question, are you better off than you were yesterday? Yes. Do you think you'll be better off tomorrow? Yes. If the answer is yes to both questions, then you're safe as a leader or as a ruler, right? So to that extent, but he still has to worry about what his people think.
In China. But that's
whether
not the
it's
case
within,
in India.
it may not be a democracy, but he still has to worry whether rivals in the party, whether the population, whether other people, and there are power centers in China like in anywhere else. Human beings play politics wherever they are, whatever the system. You can't do without it. We also have a strong leader who has an image as a strong man. Came to power saying, I will show them red eyes, I will, So it becomes what happens when you have leaders like that, strong men. It becomes harder to compromise, to bargain, to do the give and take. That is the stuff of...
strong man with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes...
Fighting.
Either they can settle everything if they get along well and they can do it. But that's clearly not where we are now. So I think, so now we're locked into a stalemate with the Chinese, where political relations are very abnormal, they're not good. We have over 100,000 troops lined up on the border facing each other in the western sector. Yet economic relations are booming. They're our second largest trade partner after the US. And that seems to go on. So you have this very anomalous situation in your relationship with China.
But do you think the current government is doing good in whatever way they are maintaining this thing between China, the tussle they have with China?
For me, the only criteria by which you judge is not by the narrative and the propaganda, we stood up or you sat down or whatever you want to, hawks, doves, all that. For me, the only thing is the outcome. And today, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's too early to say that they have dealt with this successfully or not. I will say they've dealt with it successfully if this standoff on the border ends, either in our favor or leads to a better state of the relationship where you can predict what's going to happen, where you pacify the boundary, in other words, one way or the other, in some lasting way which will last. The ultimate guarantee of that, of a pacified border, is actually a balance of force, where the equivalent, where he knows that you also can either upset the balance or maintain the balance and prevent radical change by either side. So, but based on that, you also need to have a set of understandings of how you'll go about it. And that, for me, would be a positive outcome. Negative outcome would be either going on like this or regressing and actually losing more territory or more trouble, because then you have to expend effort, your treasure, your blood. So It's too early to say. To say that yes, they've dealt successfully or they haven't dealt successfully. I mean, we're still locked in the middle of a stalemate.
But before this government also, there were multiple governments.
Well, there have been periods of very bad results in dealing with China. 1962 was not a great victory. I mean, that was... We've also had successful periods. We had 30 years of peace where the border stayed as it was, nothing changed. And we went, and those were the best years actually when India did best in terms of, because we didn't have that distraction and we went off. They were also the years when China did best. So I'd say roughly from 1988 onwards, for about 30 years, things stayed the same. We put the border aside. We managed the border problem well. But when the Chinese thought the balance had shifted in their favor, then you started getting trouble from 2013 onwards, starting in Depsang in 2013, Chumar in 2014, Doklam in 2017, and then in 2020, Galwan and the whole western sector actually. In a whole set of places when they acted simultaneously. So, and now you've gotten locked into this stalemate and confrontation. So, to say, oh, well done. Yes, we've had periods when we did very badly. We've had periods when we did better.
But this period is not good. That is at this moment.
This is neither here nor there. So you can't say, yes, we've done successful. Or that, oh, it's disaster. You can't say either because we don't know which way it's going to go. And as I said, the only real metric to judge the success of policy is the outcomes it produces.
Also, you have Pakistan as your neighbor, which is sort of...
That problem you've always had. But it's an interesting thing. Pakistan has been in secular decline now for several decades. Pakistan's relative power has declined. And China, it has therefore become more and more dependent on China. So as China has grown, Pakistan's power has declined. So your primary strategic challenge is China. And to some extent, Pakistan is a subset of your China problem. To some extent.
So if
not
we
entirely.
solve the China issue, you're saying the Pakistan issues could be solved?
When you had a decent, or at least a peaceful, steady, predictable relationship with China through the 90s, Pakistan also was much more careful. The Chinese president stood up in the Pakistani parliament in 1996, December, Chiang Zemin, and he told them, you should do with India what we are doing, which they were doing at that time, which is discuss your differences, but do the normal things, do trade, do travel, don't let it get in the way, and discuss and settle your things peacefully with them. So, but of course, Pakistanis are not happy with this advice because it meant putting Kashmir aside, right? And getting on with life, doing the normal business, trade, travel, etc. But then the Chinese started shifting. And as the trouble started between us and China, as it got harder and harder, and China became much more assertive after 2008, after they had grown very rapidly, after they saw their power. And China then started changing the way she started again talking of, oh, Kashmir is disputed territory, needs to be dealt with. She started stapled visas for people from Arunachal. You remember? All that started after that.
And about Pakistan, you have also been the Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan. How was it dealing with them? Like, obviously the people are not bad, but since you were involved in the diplomatic and political area.
You know, for a diplomat, at the individual level, even in difficult relationships, I mean, I was in China in the 70s when the relationship was really quite bad. We didn't have ambassadors, at the individual level, the professionals try to stay professional. They do their job, whatever nastiness they have to do, but it's part of the job. You try to keep the personal aside. And you understand that. He's doing his job, you do your job also. In Pakistan, it's interesting. On the street, I never faced any sense of individual hostility. But then I was there between 2003 and 2006, when there was a peace process going on, relatively successful, where we had opened up to travel, some trade had begun also, and where there were good back-channel talks on Kashmir between Mr. Lamba and Tariq Aziz on their side. So it was probably a moment of relative hope in the relationship. One of the better moments in the relationship in the last 70 years, 70 plus years. So I was lucky, but as you said, as people, I didn't sense the kind of hostility. I think the trouble is, as I keep saying, we are dealing with many Pakistans. The ordinary man in the street, he's not into all this hostility towards India and so on. In fact, he understands there's common culture, food, language, etc., the affinities he knows. The Pakistani businessman, he sees India as a possible opportunity.
Why
And
not?
it's a big economy, it's growing, it's next door, The Pakistani civilian politician, he'll go either way. It depends.
They come
They
in
come
and
and
they come
go,
out.
and he'll go either way. But there are parts of the Pakistani system which are very powerful,
Okay.
which are institutionally antagonistic to India. And the Pakistan army, with the ISI especially within it, I mean, they have an institutional interest in
Is it,
some hostility, right?
Like, sorry to cut in, but is it true that in Pakistan you have military-based or rule and not the democratic one
Well, the military is very powerful.
in
There's no
Pakistan?
question. It is both a political actor and an economic actor even. But
Economically.
it sets the rules and it decides, it has a decisive say in the politics of Pakistan. And one reason why it can do so is because of the hostility with India. This justifies their role, because we are the only ones who can protect the country, is the way they present themselves. And of course the jihadi tanzims, apart from the army, who are also very hostile to India for ideological and religious reasons. So you're dealing actually with a whole set of... So when I think it's a mistake to keep saying Pakistan, as though there's one unified set of thoughts and actions and people. It's a brand new state. It's an artificial state created after partition, by the British as they left for their own reasons. And on a theory which frankly I don't think makes sense, that religion can be the basis of a state or of
So
nationalism.
Pakistan should have been made a separate country also.
Well, no, what I'm saying is it's built on the theory that religion can be the basis of nationalism and that a state can be built on the basis of that nationalism. That's something that hasn't been proved yet. Nowhere in the world. I mean, there's only one other experiment like that, and that's Israel. So there is a fundamental problem there, a fundamental issue there. So when we say Pakistan, what are we talking about here? For me, there are many Pakistans, and you should deal with it accordingly.
And talking about Israel only, from here there's this so-called social media and Twitter people and liberals we have. And I am very sure you teach in Ashoka, you must have encountered pretty much all of them. So from there only, sir, how do you see this whole narrative of, polling and deciding everything, this whole boycott nature of things, this war happening in Israel and Palestine? There might be a Gen Z person who have just seen it, who have seen some clips about war, and they suddenly get this outrage to put on social media that boycott Israel and all that stuff, and then they are completely against the whole capitalist thing, and all that then goes on and on in the whole cycle. So
Well,
how do you see
I'm
this?
not really sure what, I don't follow this kind of social media and so on.
Okay.
But it seems to me, from what you're saying, this is mixing up 25 different things together. I mean, what happened on 7th October was an outrage, what Hamas did. It's terrorism. But what Israel is doing now to innocent civilians in Gaza is not much better.
Okay.
Because, to attack innocent civilians, to try and clear Gaza of people and to starve them, and to kill well over 23,000 people, according to the UN. I mean, that's not proportionate retaliation.
Boycotting Israel is the right thing?
No, I'm not quite sure that will boycott achieve it, because boycott has been going on now for many years.
Yes.
Especially in Europe and so on, it's quite powerful. I'm not sure that's the answer. The answer has to be among the Israelis themselves, and not all Israelis agree with this, with what Israel is doing. So I think the problem here is, when you create a moral equivalence like this, each one is playing his own game. Hamas is doing this in order to try and unite Palestinians who didn't support Hamas as a majority, trying to get them behind it, saying, look at the Israelis, look what they've done. They wanted to provoke a disproportionate response. That's what the terrorist does, right? One act of violence which will provoke a disproportionate response and give him a whole set of recruits and support in his population, the ones he claims to be speaking for. And that's what Hamas did. But on the Israeli side also, you have a prime minister who is desperate to stay in power, who faces all kinds of domestic challenges, legal, etc., and who therefore sees the war as an opportunity to unite the country behind him. And so, unfortunately, the politics on each side actually is feeding this violence, and the only solution to it is political. And each one is taking a stand based on what suits them in their domestic political calculus. Biden thinks it helps him, so he supports Israel. Previous US administrations didn't do that. During the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt, Syria combined and attacked Israel, the US stepped in to stop the war and stop Israel actually from crossing the canal and getting into Cairo in Egypt. I mean, they played a very different role. In the earlier war, in the first one, in not 48 but in 56, when France, Britain and Israel attacked Egypt and took over the canal, the US forced them to withdraw. So, the US can play on whichever side depending, but the calculus is obviously what works for me at home.
And what works for India at this moment?
For India at this moment, I think we are still saying now, I mean, at some stages people said, oh, India's shifted, India's moving and so on. I think we're saying what actually suits our interest. In the Middle East, we have never in the past chosen to take sides in between one or the other. We've stood for what we think is right. And we've stayed out of their domestic politics, unlike most other countries, which is why we could therefore work with Israel and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and all the powers, Iran, all at the same time. And we're one of the few who could do this consistently, because we stayed out of their domestic politics and we took a stand based on what we considered right, a principled stand. So now we support a two-state solution. We've recognized the Palestinian state already, but we also condemn the terrorist action.
That Israel is doing?
No, that the Hamas did.
Okay, yeah, Hamas did.
That was the terrorist action. And frankly, it makes no sense. And I think we also now have asked for a ceasefire. Initially, we abstained on one of the resolutions, but since then we've gone back to a middle position. So for me, that's the right position. Because
supporting,
why?
Understanding both.
Because it's in your interest to get peace back in the Middle East. You have almost 8 million people living and working around the Gulf. You've seen the consequences. Now you see Houthi attacks on ships. You see oil prices rising as a result. You don't want trouble in the Gulf. You don't want, because what will you do? How will you handle this? You get your oil from there. Right now you're getting Russian oil. But now in the last few months, the Saudis are back, actually, as your main supplier. But that you depend on them for oil. You depend on them out of the $125 billion of remittances you got last year, almost 70% came out of the Gulf. So remittances, oil, your people, 8 million of them, that's not a small number. So you have an interest in maintaining the peace there and in speaking for peace and for a peaceful solution and in doing whatever you can for that. And frankly, that's what I think we are doing and should be doing.
Okay. Okay, so from there, moving towards the end of this conversation, seeing this course, the whole course of this conversation that we had, and also seeing what our country is at the moment going through, just like I gave you one example of the social media campaigns of Gen Z. There's too much of left and right here.
Yeah.
There might be some people who are centrist also,
Too much polarization. Right.
might be termed as opportunist also by some people who are centrist. So there's a lot of confusion that goes in making your day-to-day decisions, which at the end adds up to your country's whole secular policy.
Right.
So what do you think that people should take one thing from diplomacy and inculcate that into their own personal lives?
Well, for a diplomat, it's interesting because you don't have a gun, right? You can't force people. So when you negotiate, when you try and do an agreement, you don't just try to win 100%. This is for people who are polarized and think I have to destroy anybody who differs with me. You try to draft an agreement where you get as much as you can, but where the other person also has enough so that he has an interest in implementing it. If you win 100% and he gets 0, he'll walk away from the table and tear up the agreement tomorrow. He'll do everything in his power, like Versailles, like what Germany did after being humiliated in Versailles after the First World War, right? So you have to give him enough to make it in his interest to implement the agreement. Otherwise, what's the use of getting everything on a piece of paper without? So make sure that you can think for the other person also. Maximize your gains. There's nothing wrong with that.
Being a bit selfish.
Be selfish. But remember, it's in your interest to make sure that the other fellow also gets something.
Yes.
That you don't just leave him empty-handed with no recourse except to either react violently or to cut you off or to... After all, you have an interest in this. But you want it implemented by him, make sure that he gets something too. And for me, that's the lesson of diplomacy.
And you
That
would
you
like to
have
give
to,
to people.
that you have to think for other people also, and not just about your own victory. And that's what lasts in the long run. Those are the deals that work.
Okay. And this is the advice to all the people also.
No, you were saying because we're in a polarized situation where people, see everything in black and white. I'm right, everybody else is wrong.
How do you see
And-
it? The grayscale?
I think the gray is where you actually can make a difference. The extremes are the extremes. It's very hard to. But most people are in the middle somewhere. They're confused, they go this way, that way. And for most people, life is not either everything assured and guaranteed and perfect, or completely miserable and gone. You're somewhere in the gray and you're still negotiating, right? For most things you have to negotiate. You have to live with other people. You have to work with other people. You have to try and get your way through life. So think of the other person also. And it's in your interest to do so. That's my point.
No matter how badly you hate them.
You still have to make sure that at least you don't drive them to the wall. Mao Zedong used to quote this old Chinese saying, always give your enemy a way out. Not that you let him escape, but he must know there's an open door behind him. Then he'll retreat. But if you put his back against the wall, he'll fight like a tiger.
Yes.
So think for him and make sure that he has some interest in doing the things that you want done. Or else give him an escape. But life is not black and white, true or false.
Yeah.
It's not binary.
I guess this pretty much summarizes the conversation very well. I hope so. I was able to do justice to this
Well,
conversation.
thank you. I enjoyed that. Thank you.
I hope you like the conversation and I was able to delve into some topics You obviously are the expert,
No,
but
I'm
I
not.
just tried to
No,
put up
you've
some
obviously thought
perspectives.
about these issues
Yeah.
and thought quite deeply. But
Thank you
all
so
the
much for
best,
that.
and thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for coming on AP Podcast.
Thanks.